Good afternoon. I am pleased to be here today. My name is Pierre Verreault. I work with the Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters, and I'll be presenting today in collaboration with John O'Sullivan from CamProf. If we can start, the presentation today is Fishing for Plural Occupations. I don't know if it's a term that exists or not, but we're certainly using it these days, part of our research project. So I will start giving a brief explanation of what the Canadian Council is and what the study is. The Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters is a national federation of fish harvesters organization. We have members on the Atlantic and the Pacific as well as freshwater, and also First Nations involved in commercial fisheries. There are about over 20,000 fishing enterprises in this country, most of them being less than 65-foot boats. Like 90% of the fleet is small boats. So we work with what we call the independent fleet. So the study we started to do was, it's funded by the Sexual Initiative Program at ESDC. We got about $1.4 million to do that. It's a labor market information project, which the way we started looking at it, labor market information project is quite common thing you do in the industry, but this time what we said is like, we started thinking about seasonality. How are we going to address the issue of seasonality? The industry is less attractive mainly because of short seasons, and of course that impacts the revenues as well of people involved in the industry. So instead of we started looking at seasonality as kind of a reservoir of skills and how we could use these skills for the fishing season. Talking about the seasonality, what we realize is very much that most of the policies in this country related to labor are not to address seasonal jobs. They usually deal with full-time jobs. So they did some research on seasonality in Quebec, and they asked us what part of the GDP it was. So when we extended their methodology to the rest of the country, we found out that 25% of the GDP in Canada is seasonal. 28%, if we take off the public and parapublic sector of the GDP, is seasonal. It'd be hard push to say, can we just get rid of every industry that is seasonal in this country, but at the same time, policies are not adapted to it. So it'll be the next slide. So we can see here, just to give you an idea, because we often hear that fisheries is a dying industry, you've heard it all. So if we look at the agri-food as in general, and actually these figures are out from the from Minister Morneau's panel on economic growth. Agri-food in Canada is 2.1 million people. It's 6.7% of the GDP, and it has a annual growth of 2.7% between 2000 and 2015. And the figures we see below are solely about seafood and fisheries. In Atlantic Canada, between 2000 and 2015, the seafood export have grown by 84%, while the general export in the Atlantic Canada is a net 5% more. I suppose if you take out fisheries out of that picture, you may have a negative growth in exports in Atlantic Canada. And if you look at the overall picture for Canada, the average growth in exports was 17% during that time period, while it was 46% in the fisheries. So that brings us, so there is good condition in the fisheries as an industry. So what we're seeing here, there's a big potential for the fisheries. Resources there, most of the commercial stocks in Canada are in good shape and are yielding good landings. Price is good. Markets are expanding, especially towards Asia, also through the signature of CETA with Europe. Canada is an exporter of seafood. We produce a lot and we eat very little of it. But then what we found in the study, if you look at a little graphic, fish stocks are in good shape, markets, good demand. But the issue is that labor force, or the lack of it, may become an impediment to the development of the fishery. It is an important thing, especially in coastal communities. This is the biggest economic engine in Atlantic Canada, fisheries. So what we've done, we started thinking about how, if we want to attract people to the fishery with short season, because that's part of the issue. The workforce is aging, seasons are short, so it's not necessarily attractive for young people to commit, get the training you need, because it's a fairly skilled job you have to do, plus all official and certification you need from Transport Canada. Invest in a fishing enterprise, and sometimes the work period is small, is short. And what we hear as well from young people, it's not only about money. You don't want to invest in a career where you're going to work 8, 7, 9 months of the year. So we came up with a concept of occupational pluralism. What we mean by that, traditionally, fish harvesters have been working in other industry of the season. It was often forestry or agriculture or mining. Through history, all these sectors tended to professionalize or to become more specific, and that mobility was lost. So we started to look at it in the sense that, like 20 years ago, we started, maybe 30 years ago, saying, you know, it's a typical career where you start working somewhere, and 25 years after you've been there, you get a gold watch and a pension fund, and you can go retire. It no longer exists. You have different jobs during your career. And so we start looking at it, what it means to stay in the fishing in a rural community. What I'm going to say to them, talking about fishing communities, but it applies in many other rural communities. It means maybe that through the year, not through stages in your life, but through the year, you may have to have different occupations. So then comes all the problem, how you recognize skills and move them around. So that's why we're here today talking about it. So, you take this slide, or I take the...
You can do this one, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll do the next one. So can you flip it?
No, you do this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, the next one. All right. I'm just going to say a few words on that one, and you complete on that. So, one of the objectives through the projects was to identify where would fishermen or fish harvesters would work outside the fishing season. At the time, the big thing was they would all go to Alberta working on the oil patch, but that's gone. And as well, and it's always, it's not everybody is ready to expat. Maybe mobility also changes through your life cycles. You know, when you're 20 years old, you're single, you're ready to go anywhere. When you got 3 kids at home, you may want to stay there in your community. So we look at mobility on a different level. Within the community, within the marine sector, and geographical mobility. So we had focus group, surveys, and the people express in there what kind of jobs they'd like to do outside the fishing season. And from here, I'm going to leave it to John and explain how they started working with us on this one. Maybe we'll tell you that when we have a desperate project and a desperate cause to do, we always call them. So.
Thank you, Pierre. And thank you, everybody, for coming to this presentation. And you realise by now I'm not Canadian. I'm actually from London, UK. But I do come to Canada very often, several times a year, particularly to Toronto, where I've got family and friends. And it is a pleasure to attend and speak at CAPLA again. And it's also been my pleasure to lead the CamProf team that's been working with Pierre and the Council on this project for several months earlier this year. So, our job was to take a long list of possible occupations because, as Pierre has explained, there is a history of fishermen and fisherwomen, and there are fisherwomen working in other jobs off-season, when the weather's bad, when the weather's good, whatever, but in an informal and unrecognised way often. So we took this long list and boiled it down to a more precise and more focused list. We then do a detailed crawl through the National Occupational Standard, which was brand new, produced by the Sector Council, and we compare that with similar data from these other target occupations. We devise a way of communicating the findings, both positive and negative, particularly aiming at identifying what are the transferable skills, but also what are the skills gaps, and what about certifications and regulations and recognition, and what about PLA? And we'll get to that in a moment. Clearly fisher folk have got many relevant competencies. Water safety, but safety generally, mechanical safety. They're good at electrical, electronics, navigation, computers, technology generally. Pierre has explained many of them are small businesses. In fact, the vast majority are really small businesses. So they've got marketing, they've got employment, they've got accounting, they've got financing, they've got legal, contracting. Obviously it's water-based, therefore it's outdoors. They're interested in the environment, they work in all weathers, clearly related to tourism, and don't forget they're part of the food chain. They're the very upfront bit of the food chain with responsibilities for food safety, food handling, and so on. Our methodology was, as I said, refine the target occupations by a preliminary scan, detailed, precise analysis of the competency framework with comparable documents where we could get them. And that turned out to be a variety of documents. We'll deal with that in a moment. We judged the degree of match by a real simple 4-point scale. We then looked at the certifications, regulations, the training requirements, and we prepared a device, a communications tool, if you like, in order to communicate this information. These are the 13 that we ended up with. They start at the top left with water-related jobs mostly, but then they go into a variety of other occupations. Here are the main data sources that we used. So I've mentioned the competency framework, but let me mention it again. It's a very vital document. We could not have done this task without it. Some of the other occupations, for example, the tourism ones, have got a very good set of national occupational standards. Others have got some documents. One had nothing at all, in which case we used a foreign document that looked to us to be a good enough start for this purpose. There's a document called COPS, Canadian Occupational Projection System, which is a forward-looking forecast of the likely gains and likely losses by occupation in a very detailed breakdown of occupations. So that was our main document for opportunities. Transport Canada is the main regulatory body for the fishing sector. And then we looked at all the training providers in all the provinces that were relevant. Here is the real simple 4-point scale. It's so simple as to be stupid, and that's ideal. This is what we need. I'm really dead against 5-point scales or 3-point scales because everyone plumps for the middle. You've got to make people think. So there's little or no or very weak match, or there's some match, or there's a good match, or there's a very strong match. That's what we've ended up with. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of the 13 that we looked at. We've got the other 11, of course. And this is, there's 3 slides for each one. So this is a heavy equipment operator. For example, a snow plough. This has been a traditional task for fishermen in the winter when they can't go fishing. They get a job with the local municipal council to shift the snow. But the occupational standard doesn't just say snow ploughs, it's heavy equipment operator. It has a national occupational code that's up there, and there's 10 or 20 variants. There's bulldozers, there's mobile cranes, there's tow trucks for car breakdowns, there's tow trucks for large scale, and so on. So you can see the top left-hand panel is the opportunities. There are currently almost 80,000 such jobs across Canada. The average age is there. It's a bit younger than the average fisherman, so this is a good sign. Overall, the forecast is that the supply is about equal to the demand, but it's quite a high annual transition. The outlook is fair for those 3 provinces and limited for PEI, but then most things are limited for PEI.
Any angry Pierre?
The occupation is highly regulated, far too many different regulations to list on this slide, but they're on the next. But the good news is training is available all over the country. And another good news is there is a national occupational standard, and it's a good one from Trucking HR Canada. And by the way, CamProf has done 2 projects for trucking. Don.
You're saying that shifting snow is a nice springboard into the other heavy equipment type occupations because they might be doing snow removal already?
Yes, there is a tradition, Pierre, is there not, of fishermen doing snow ploughing.
But there's also a limited number of jobs of snow plowing in the village. But traditionally, that's the kind of job they will take.
Still with heavy equipment operator. So on the panel on the left is the main skills that we found were transferable. So these are formally recognised in the fishing occupational standard and formally recognised in the heavy equipment operator. So all the obvious ones. The right-hand panel is possible skill gaps. I say possible because it does not mean that the fisherman has these skill gaps. It means they're not required to be a fisherman and they're not in the fisherman job spec. But many fishermen would have them because the underlying competence is the same. Working an engine, repairing something, doing a bit of rewiring, mechanical skills generally, spatial skills, navigation. Parking a boat maybe isn't too different to parking a truck. Only one ship should manoeuvre by the quayside at any one time, only one truck should manoeuvre in the yard at one time, and so on. And a third slide, again there were 3 for every occupation, Pierre, are about certifications and things to look out for. So possible requirements there on the right hand side, hazmat. Now not all of these are required for every variant, depending on the province, depending on the piece of equipment, and depending on the employer. You may need some of these things. Things to look out for: noise, dust, sitting for long periods, you have to use equipment, and so on. Main targets: oil industry, mining, forestry, and snow ploughing. Second example, the same format, is an outdoor guide, highly linked to tourism. So in this, as illustrated, a ski instructor, but on the here a long list of canoeing, fishing, rafting, mountain climbing, and so on and so on and so on. So these guys, you know, they're self-motivated, they're you know, they can handle themselves, they're comfortable being outdoors, out and about, responsible for the safety of a vessel and a bunch of people. This is a good opportunity. And again, there is a national occupational standard from the Tourism Sector Council, and this was a good one. And there are, again, many variants of this, but they're all good ones. Quite a lot of transferable skills: trip planning, assembling the equipment, actually conducting the trip, and so on. Handling emergencies, don't panic, deal with it, communications, complying with regulations. And again, skills gaps, there might not be gaps, but they're not in the 2 documents. So that's to be watched. And the third slide for outdoor guide, yes, the regulations. Depending on what the guiding is, there are certifications and regulations, and training is generally available. So we did this sort of 3 slides for all of the 13. All this data was then, that's really just for presentation purposes. For delivery to our client, there were 2 main formats on the next slide. So the portrait style on the left was a real simple, easy to use, aimed at the fisherman or fisherwoman themselves, and suitable for display on a computer or a smartphone or a tablet. That's the idea. And each of the 13 occupations was boiled down to, this typically took between 2 and 5 or 6 pages, screens. But the whole technical data is then assembled in a substantial spreadsheet document, right down to the individual elements, whatever was the lowest element of each competency profile. So that came to anything between, up to 20, 30 pages per occupation.
So the list you provided earlier, the 2 columns of the 13
The 13, yeah. All of them had both of those.
And was that in order? The 13 you gave me, or was it like in order of match?
No, that order was roughly to put water-related stuff first, because it was a convenient way of doing it. No great shapes, no.
If I may, geography has a lot to do with it. If you're, for instance, freshwater in Manitoba, in the north, going from lake to lake to conduct your fishery, you often of the season you'll be involved in outfitting. And if you're on the west coast where they transport stuff by barge, then tug industry it becomes a clear one. Geography also influenced that.
Yet another deliverable was a simple guide for the fishermen. That's really the left hand, just the straightforward process of how to go about it. Because many of them, it's obvious really, but many of them might be obvious to us, not so obvious to all of them. So, select your occupation, research it a bit, and the web portal that is under development and a self-assessment tool that's under development will help. On the right-hand side, the sources of information. Most of all, get some training, get the certifications, and then get looking for a job. And those are all the sort of standard processes that you would go through. And seeing as this is CAPLA, what about PLA? We were looking hard for PLA. We were looking for, were there any well-trodden routes from fishing to one of our 13? Was there even a signpost? Was there even a country lane? Or a hole in the hedge even? I regret we found absolutely none. Despite Chip's work and everyone else's work in CAPLA for so many years,
No sign.
I regret this was a big disappointment. We were not able to find anything. Yes. So, even these regulations from Transport Canada, even though they, it might be 90% comparable with what you need for truck driving, oh no, you cannot read across. Oh no, you can't have a transition route. Oh no, you've got to do the whole 9 yards. So this is an area of potential future work and further. Well, yeah, why not the council? Pierre will say something in a moment. Yeah. So, in fact, I think Pierre will say something right now because I think that's the next. Yes. What next?
What's next?
Pierre.
Oh, economic values. Oh, you want to finish. What is next? There's a lot to come if he was working there for many years. Well, I started without gray hair, and maybe at the end I'll have no hair. First, it's ease the route into occupational pluralism. It sounds fairly easy like that in theory, but the difference between theory and practice, and theory they're the same, in practice they're different. We almost realize doing focus group, some cases it's almost have to be case by case. You're at the local community with the economic development people. They know what kind of jobs that would need to be filled, and they start looking at potential candidates, and then they line up classes and training. But that's a good thing as well. At the local level, people know that's how you're going to do that. To line up training with the school board, and then they get trained, and then they can go on the job. This is one thing. For us, we need to understand it a bit more. It's easy to say, okay, when they have the fishing season, they could go in boat building. But where's boat building happening? Is it at the same time than the fishing season? And all kind. This is part of it. We want to have another project on that. This is part of it, to really to study it more, as well the details of it, because that's where the devil is, as well as looking into doing some pilots, putting it on trial to see what it does. Develop and implement the portal. It's been underway. There's many things in the future we'd like to do with that portal. What it does right now, I could have brought it here, give a trial, and it's always the same. When you do it live in front of people, it crashes. But it's not ready. What's behind the portal is constructed, but we have to put an image onto that. So what the portal does, it will do pretty much what they've done using the skills assessment done by CamProf. Fish harvesters will go on the portal. They will click, depending what they do, then it appears all the skills they already have. They will be prompted as well to see, you may have done some other jobs and have other skills, so start clicking some. And then it will compare it with different jobs and also direct them on more information. Is there a professional association? What is the resources in your province? And things like that. That's what the portal will do. Eventually, we'd like the portal to do much more, but for now, it's what it does. And then we have a very, I think, would be quite interesting. We're talking about recognizing skills so people can move them around. So there's a new thing, it's called the e-badges. It's micro-credential. We're planning 2 pilots on that one. We're going to work with youth. We came also to a certain conclusion. If you're 60 and you're already doing occupational pluralism, there isn't much we can do for you. You're doing it. And if you're 60, you're not doing it, you probably won't do it. So we're going to start more with young people. So what we want to do, especially in British Columbia, where it's a given that you need to work outside of fishing season. Other places, and I'll address it a bit in the next slide, sometimes it's not, there's a sensitivities around that. But where it's a given, you recognize these skills through, and also eventually would like to build it to a point that will almost makes a certification to move from one industry to the other. So we're going to approach other industry. I'm glad Chip is sitting in front of me, because he's the kind of person we need to approach to see how we could start looking into that. The other project we want to do with the badges is with First Nation community. First Nation community is a big component of the Canadian fisheries, and work in the fisheries is also very important for First Nation communities in coastal areas. So, but in addition to the fishery skills, what we'd like to do there is really include a cultural aspect of it. So this cultural aspect and recognition through micro credential and badges would certainly help, could help in other industries like tourism as well as maintaining a sense of the community for First Nations. And also, we would like the micro badges, the badges and micro credentials to recognize traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge, every time you speak, like managing the environment is a big thing, and I think it'd be really nice to look into that, how we can formalize and recognize that. That would certainly be a very interesting part of it. So, and the last one is training for identified gap. One of the pilots we want to do is really okay, here's where you're missing. We develop specific training so you don't have to go through the whole thing, and then we see what it does. I'll talk about next slide. All right. The social and economic value of that project. First, I have to say, there's lots of sensitivities as an industry group on that. There's a very fine line between, are we attracting people in the industry, and off the fishing season, they can do something else in their community or somewhere else or in another sector, so that allows them to remain in the industry, or we're training people so they can go work somewhere else. So as an industry group, we always have to walk that fine line. Actually, the pilot strategy was a bit part of it, because then we can geographically focus it where they really need it. Like where it's a given, you do something outside the fishing season, because the project covers a bit more than that. The project also covers, can we just fish longer? Because that's what we heard first. Like, you ask fishermen, what could you do if you would like to work more? I would like to fish longer. So so that part was there. It comes with its challenges of fisheries management, resource issues, weather issues. Sometimes the ocean is frozen, and the resource can only support a certain level of harvest, as well as you need to respect biological cycle of the resource. So that comes to all. So of course, part of reducing the impact of seasonality is to see you can make longer seasons, but occupational pluralism, that's what we focus on here today, is part of it. But it comes for us with certain issue. So of course, the whole idea is to support the coastal and rural regions. Although if you look at the ESDC's website, what is the forecast for working in the fisheries, they're not really good. But the reality is the following. Probably the number of people working in industry won't really increase. But when people start retiring, because people in the industry are much older than most of Canadian industry, people are not in the industry right now to replace them. Worse, they're not in rural communities, they're not in fishing communities to replace them. So that's related with the aging and the rural exodus of people. So that's the whole point. The idea is to attract and retain the young entrants. It's not to drive existing working out or other young people, because for young people we hear different things. What it is to be a fish harvester, I would like to do something else. Ideally close to the water. If I decide to be a fisherman, it's because I like to be on water. So we'll try to look into that. And I don't want to do something I love for 2 or 3 months and then do nothing else for the rest of the year. So if I can use my skill somewhere else, I appreciate that. So it's very much about the occupational pluralism, about what I was describing, what through a year, what it is to live and work in a rural coastal community. So, and of course, it's certainly, ESDC's got a strong interest, sharp interest in our project, because it cannot, whatever happens for the fisheries is also true for the other seasonal industry, especially the rural-based ones. And as I was saying, it is an important part of the economy, and there's basically no policies that are adapted to it. Basically, the only policy adapted to rural economies and seasonality is in the fishing sector. There's a special EI where you got different set of rules, and that's basically it. At the time, instead of having an insurance for the crop insurance, the government didn't want it implemented in the fishery. They said, why don't we use the EI system to do that? So it basically is like a minimum wage through the year. So if you get a bad fishing season, you can stay in the industry whose EI system will support you, and if you have a better season, then it claws it back. So that's pretty much it. One of the reasons why young people stopped to get in at a certain point, the conditions weren't that good, even 4 years ago. And one of the conditions, people were working, we got to a situation basically where crew members were the same age of captains. And they didn't really, when you asked them, will you become an owner or operator? They would say no. Not necessarily because they didn't want it to, but suddenly they realized it was unrealistic for them. They wouldn't buy an enterprise at the age of 50 when they were, of 55 or 60, when their captain will retire. But for young people, what we're working on the side is we need to give them that capacity to access the fishing enterprise. They're worth quite a lot these days. When you get good years, the prices of enterprise, how do they set the cattle aside? There are loan boards, but part of the industry and part of the next project we do, although it doesn't relate directly to that, is really much about defining a strategy to make young people to be able to become captains and owner-operator and lead the enterprise. Because it's the desire about half of the young people that get into the industry. One of the reasons, about half of them, one of the reasons for getting in the industry is one day I want to be the owner of the enterprise. Flour has been used in the fishing industry. There's a couple of problems where there's a certification board. So at the time, there were, it's interesting because it was not all positive. At the time, they put in place a certification program, so they would grandfather people that have been fishing for a while, and with a set of criteria. But if you didn't fill all the criteria and you said, you know, but I still have the competences, I'm able to do that, then you would go through a PLAR process. And what happened then, the PLAR became, you know, if something measures what you know, it also measures what you don't know on the other side of the coin. So then it became the rumor in the industry that they will send you finish your high school. It was a struggle. It was the point that PLAR was a thing you could get PLAR'd. That was something bad that would happen to you. But of course, in this, it only makes sense to use PLAR, especially if you're a certified fisherman, it's clear you get, or you have sufficient experience, it's clear you get a fishing experience. But you may have done some other jobs as well. So looking, that's part, when we say we're going to line up training, it would certainly include a PLAR thing, a PLAR section of it where, okay, here's your fisherman skills, you say you have the other skills, here's the requirement for your industry you'd like to work. If there are gaps, if you think you have the skills, can we use a PLAR tool just to reduce your training time? When we're talking about adapting training, it includes PLAR.
On your self-assessment tool,
Yes.
is it, so if someone would go on your website, do the self-assessment, and it would automatically spit out a report to them right on the spot?
Yes.
What's the programming behind that?
I wouldn't be able to say. We hired a tech firm. I don't know if they customize the whole thing or they use another platform. I wouldn't be able to say.
So there must be a database related.
Yes, there'd be a database.
What's your ongoing maintenance of the site with the company, with yourselves?
Yeah.
How are you gonna handle that?
As for now, it's a fairly static portal. You're not able to sign in or anything like that, but these are all add-ons we want to do. So we're not there yet.
Work in progress.
Yeah, and there's the skills, and there's the geography, as I was saying, and there's the idea you still have a marine-related, you know, you were part of building a boat in your community.
Clearly there's an affinity. Time is up, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention and thank you for coming.
Thank you.